So, hi everyone.
Hi.
We're so excited to be here with you. My name is Kelsey. I've been a PM at Figma for about 6 months now. Before that, I spent 5 years at Netflix, helping them build their studio from the ground up. This is the first cross-Atlantic live presentation I've done, which is pretty wild. I'm joining in all the way from Idaho, and you should have already seen Niko. He's joining from our studio in London.
Yeah, exactly. I just switched into this other room, and there's I have to look a little bit down. So sorry if I have to look away from the camera. It's quite high up. But yeah, I've been at Figma for 2.5 years and just basically worked on prototyping, and I still really can't wrap my head around the just announced interactive components. We've been working on that for a long time, but we're actually not here to talk about interactive components. Although I'd love to do that at some point. Kelsey, we should definitely do that. But yeah, we're actually going to talk about something different today.
So today we're going to talk about failing together, and we can finally talk about what the talk is about, failing together on the design for variants. So we're going to walk you through our process behind the scenes, starting with a few stories and ending with some reflections on the process and how iterating and failing together in the open helped us build a better product and have a lot of fun along the way. So earlier today, we announced a feature called variants, which allows you to logically group together similar components. And this means that instead of traversing those crazy instance menus some of you have probably seen, you can now just pick from a set of dropdowns or properties that are logically grouped together. And this makes it easier to select a variant, and it also allows your components to map more closely to your code. But before we dive into stories, I want to just spend a couple minutes getting oriented. I mentioned properties earlier, but what do I really mean by that? So sometimes components are pretty simple, like you have a button with 3 different states. But as your components get more complex, you'll likely start seeing these sort of cross-sections or dimensions to them. So what type of button is it? It could be primary or secondary. What size is it, small or large? Does it have an icon? What state is it in? And variants allows you to organize these dimensions into properties. And these properties generate a custom UI for easily swapping between variants. So to quickly recap, every button here is a variant. The properties represent the dimensions of your component, like type or size, and live in the right panel. And each property has a set of values, which are represented by the pills on the screen. And so if you tuned into the session before us, you heard Sho talk about some of the early product thinking behind this feature. In this talk, we'll be sharing more on what happened once we started building, and we'll share some of our failures along the way. So by February this year, we had a lot of the high-level product thinking ironed out, but we still needed to think through the authoring experience. So fairly early on in the process, we knew we wanted to have a consumption experience that looked something like this with dropdowns for property values. But we had a big open question, which was how would users actually author the setup? So the most straightforward way to manage properties would probably be through layer names. So users could just define properties with these key equals value pairs in the layer names. And we already use / naming conventions to manage how components show up in the instance menu. And that made us feel like managing variants through layer names was actually a pretty reasonable approach. So we built it. And then a few weeks later, the team had a version running. And after using it ourselves, we realized that it was really powerful, but it wasn't very approachable. So let's say you wanted to reorder the properties so that size comes before type. You could definitely do this with some fancy regex magic, but honestly, I tried to create an example for this slide, and I probably Googled for about 10 minutes before I just gave up. So I guess case in point, this is not super approachable to use. But we knew we wanted this feature to be one that anyone at Figma could use, or any Figma user could. So we went back to the drawing board. And for context, at this point, I was about 2 weeks into my new job at Figma, so I really had no idea what was going on. But I jumped in with Niko, Rasmus, and Cho, and we set out to design an authoring UI for variants. And it turns out 2 PMs and 2 designers can create a lot of ideas together. We explored using dialogues to manage what were then called states. And then we thought maybe we could like attach that dialogue to this and make this dialogue tooltip thing. But there were just so many questions that we needed to answer, and they were all interconnected. One of the core questions, of course, was how will users create a variant, but also how would they create new properties? And where would they edit those properties? And you probably know how this feels. As soon as you solve one question, another one just comes up out of nowhere. But slowly but surely, we developed an idea of how this could all come together. And eventually we filtered it down to a single version that we felt pretty okay about. So we built it. And by May, we were ready to test it with users. And what we thought would be a short round of usability tests over maybe a couple of weeks turned into a 6-week sprint with 4 rounds of iterations. In other words, it turned out that we were much further off than we realized. So we thought we'd give you a look behind the scenes at a few of our decisions and learnings along the way.
Cool. We'll start out with something fun. Like all of the core problems that we were tackling had something to do with like allowing the users to add something. For example, people, of course, needed to add variants in one way or the other, but they also needed properties so they could structure those variants. But those properties in itself are not useful. You need the values that are inside of those properties. And while all of those could work with a plus in the UI, actually, let's look at an example and do a pub quiz. Like I have the live chat here on a different screen. And so let's say we have this set up. There's a couple of buttons here that we see, and we have a couple of variants inside of that parent container. We have that selected. And the question for you all is now, what would happen? What do you think would happen if you click on this plus? I'll give you a couple of options. So option A is that it will duplicate those buttons on the canvas. Option B is that it will create a new property in this properties panel. And option C is that it will create a new value in the first property. And so let's hear it in the chat. Who thinks that it's going to be kind of like option A, duplicating the buttons on the canvas, option B, creating a new property, or option C, creating a new value in the first property? And the chat, the live chat here is a little bit behind. So we have to like wait a little, but like let's talk about this. Kelsey, what do you think?
Well, I feel like it's kind of cheating for me to say what I think it is, but I'm going to go with B, creating a new property.
Okay, we see the first trickling in. Someone saying option D, none of the above. Okay, interesting. Actually, this is pretty cool to see the live chat.
This is cool.
Pretty wild. Okay, let's reveal the answer. The answer is yes, you're all right. Like, and so sorry everyone who was like, oh yeah, this is a game, I'm gonna win. Like you all win. This is like peace and love here. And all of you were right. The tricky thing with this plus ultimately was that depending on the context and the right use case, or the use case that the user came from, like what interactions they did before, depending on that, they expected a different thing to happen. And that was, I don't know, that was wild. And the solution ultimately was simple. We just decided that when we have specific variants selected, we'll just not show the plus at all. And that actually worked. So yeah, sometimes the best thing is just not to do anything.
Another thing we iterated on several times was the treatment of simple versus complex use cases. And by simple, I mean single dimensional, as in there's only one property, whereas complex or multi-dimensional has multiple properties. So one question was, how would we treat these in the UI? And another was, how would you upgrade from a simple component to a complex one? This is an early mock-up of that right panel. When you first create a variant, it lands in this UI where you have pills that represent property values, but you don't see the name of the property, which was nice for simple use cases. So you see here you have the state section with just a few floating pills for the values underneath it. What we did is, as soon as a user would add a new property, they could just name that property whatever they wanted, but the first one would remain unnamed. So you can see that the 3 initial pels are still at the top, but the second property has been renamed to type. And this created a lot of confusion for folks because they didn't understand why some of them were floating at the top and others were nested in what appeared to be these types of folders. This actually created so much confusion for folks that they literally would just delete all their variants and start over from scratch because they were like so confused. So then we thought, why don't we just make everything named? So as soon as you create a variant, we would automatically name that initial property state, and it would always be visible. So no matter what, you would always see the name of the property as well as the property values. And as you added more properties, you could continue to name them. There are a few problems with this approach. For one, people thought that state was some kind of system default that they couldn't rename. And then it also felt prescriptive about how we expected people to use the feature. So an example I have here actually does happen to be 3 states of a button, but you could imagine that you'd also want to use these to manage colors or sizes or things that actually aren't states. Plus, you just lose the simplicity of keeping the simple case simple and not having to worry about what the property is named. So what we landed on in the latest version is when you create a variant component from scratch, the default setup is a single unnamed property. And as soon as you add a second property, both of them become named. And then also if you're combining a bunch of components that already have the / naming convention, those auto-generated properties are named generically. So property 2, property 3, and so on. So it was clear that we expected users to rename them. And this worked really well in tests. And speaking of properties, some people couldn't even get to this point because they couldn't figure out how properties worked in the first place.
Yeah, well, we'll dive a little bit into how we struggled communicating this new way of structuring variants. And to recap, users are able to manually create properties and values to organize their variants. So they are able to customize the stuff that is in the properties panel that's visible in the properties panel, which is new before. But the tricky part was that this new way of structuring components required users to edit the system at 2 different levels. On one level, you have the properties that are shared across all of the variants, and those are edited when the parent container is selected. But the values are created and applied when you add them to the specific variants that are kind of like underneath or inside. And making changes of each of those levels like influences the system. And since the system was new, we needed to make sure that people were able to understand this. So our first hypothesis was to show the system at all times. And that's kind of abstract. So I'll walk you through an example. On the left, you have a parent container. By the way, I'm not like, is it above me? Like, on the left, like here, on the left, you have the parent container selected. Yeah. And on the right, you have a subset of the variant selected. And as you can see in the properties panel, the UI is basically the same. And while this is great, because it not only allowed people to edit the applied values and see those changes, how they affect the system, it also allowed you kind of like to click through and select different things and like just gave you more context, and it was cool and we liked this and like we were really excited to test this. But it turned out that people just did this. And so as you can see here, the users just consistently and really consistently recreated their old way of structuring components. They created this hierarchical way where you can see that default, hover, and disabled are redundant in each of those sections. And then primary, secondary, and destructive, which should ultimately just be values of the property, that were kind of like the first level properties in this. And so this is not to blame the users who set this up in this context. This was basically everyone. This is definitely to blame on us. We just realized that we tried to achieve our goal of understanding the system in the wrong way. And we saw it clearly in the tests. So we decided to scrap our initial hypotheses and just focus on a much simpler solution. And instead of showing the same UI in both cases, so look at this part here on the right. Yeah, we're not showing the same UI. We decided to simplify that when the variants are selected, the only thing that you can do is to change the values of each of those properties for the variants that you have selected. And so while this meant that we had to get rid of a bunch of this cool functionality we really liked, and we had some prototypes, they're like fun, really hard to understand. So although this meant we had to get rid of all of that, it ultimately was a good trade-off because in the tests following that, we saw that people understood this new way of structuring. They understood this mental model. And that was, I don't know, that was like, it clicked at some point somehow. And another top priority for us, and something that in some areas we still haven't figured out entirely, is what did we name the feature in the first place?
So fun fact, up until a couple months ago, this feature was called states internally. And as we all know, naming is the hardest part of any project, and this project was no exception. So what happened was, in the first couple rounds of usability tests, completely unprompted, users were saying things like, I think what's tripping me up is that it's called states, but it does so much more than that. States seems to water down the power of it. It should be called super customizable component that you can do whatever you want with feature. That last one was pretty funny in the moment, but honestly, it's actually a pretty good description of the feature. We even tried it. It just looked a little bit long in the UI. But in all seriousness, our users are right. It's not just states. It's a pretty powerful system for managing properties and values for components. And those properties could be for things like colors, sizes, and devices, not just states. So it's pretty clear we should try a different name. So we thought, what about variants? It felt like a more generic name. Plus, we heard a few people actually use the word variations in the sessions. So we updated all the copy and started hearing things like, the fact that it's called variants in the right panel is super clear to me. I think variants makes a lot of sense. You can have states inside of variants, but you can't have variants inside of states. And that was a really important point. States could be considered a subset of variants. A state is a type of variant or variation. But it also made sense for all of these other dimensions like types and colors. So we went with variants, which seems so obvious to us now, but honestly, what would we do without our amazing users to show us the light? We could go on and on for hours with stories about this feature.
Oh yeah, sorry, that was my cue. But we wanted to share a reflection on what was going on one additional level behind the scenes. So if you recall, we started the testing on this feature in the midst of a global pandemic. Yeah, so we were forced to do remote user testing, which in itself is not that special. It's pretty common, but a small thing that we changed for us at least was that since everyone remotely anyway, we just invited anyone to join. So Kelsey sent a notification like this, inviting anyone to join around an hour before every user test, and that was a huge success. Many people from throughout the company, engineers, product education, leadership, and designers from other teams, just basically joined in. Like they muted their mic, they didn't have any video on. We also communicated it to the participants in the first place. Like you might see a couple of people dropping in and out. Just don't worry, like focus on this. You'll just talk to us and you'll be fine. And that was great. But there was another thing that we started to do, one that was actually more impactful, even more than that. We started live chatting in our public Slack channel. And we ignored all of our Slack etiquette rules and just spammed this entire channel full with stuff. Yeah, full with like direct live reactions to what was happening in those user tests. And that increased the reach of our user tests just tremendously. Because although it wasn't always clear what was going on in the chat, like Linda, an engineer, saying, I have no idea what's happening here, but I love this play-by-play. Yeah, it was an incredible fun experience for us all. And people from all over the other parts of the company jumped in. Sarah, for example, works in product education. And with her vast knowledge about Figma's terminology, she was actually able to help out on a lot of like the nitty-gritty naming stuff. And Tom, the manager of our designer advocate team, and was just incredibly helpful throughout the development of this feature. And Kelsey, I mean, like, since he said he would watch this over Netflix 100% of the time, you should maybe go warn your colleagues that like watching user tests might become a threat to your colleagues. I don't know, maybe, could be. I'd like watch user tests. Or Jessica here, who's an engineering manager, who didn't even work on this feature, but still was in this chat and just enjoyed the live commentary that was going on. So while all of this was amazing and a lot of fun, it actually often looked like this. Rasmus saying, smiling on the outside, but fetal position in my mind, so embarrassed. Or me just being frustrated with the ideas that just didn't work out. Like, remember, we talked about the pluses earlier before. Like, trying out different combinations and seeing users not get it again and again and again. Like, that just gets to me because, like, it's my responsibility that they get it. It's not their responsibility to get it. Or it's like our responsibility to get it. Or engineers, Linda and Matthew here, spotting bugs during the live session, being like, oh, snap. Like, we should have fixed this. Or I know how to fix this. Like, that's even worse. And I mean, look at this here. We have like engineers, we have designers, and we have PMs who kind of like we're in the same position. And what all of this describes the core of this process, the part of like failing together in the open. One of my favorite comments actually is from Show that describes the atmosphere best. I was like dying for 45 minutes inside. And it's not because of that. It's not like because I wish he because like was dying 45 minutes inside. I don't know. But it's actually because the second part that he wrote. He wrote, it's all good. We're learning a ton. And that describes why this felt so great, why this just was so much fun. We did learn a ton, and everyone knew that we learned a ton. And of course, it's hard seeing that your ideas are not working. Of course, it's like frustrating when people don't get what you've designed. And I bet like a lot of you have been at that point before. But the snippet describes something incredibly important. And I think the snippet describes that failing together is just the start. That failing together ultimately is an opportunity. And it's key for us to look at it that way, because it's an opportunity for us to improve and potential for us to fail forward, to iterate, and ultimately to find a better solution together. And so that's what we did. After every round of user testing, we created like a list of observations, hypotheses, always combinations of observation, hypotheses, proposals, design, and kind of like an end spec. And so once we had that, and we knew, okay, this would kind of like take this long, this would take this long, we discussed together what we think is the most impactful thing we can do in the next round. And so why it was great, like, oh yeah, sorry. And this was great. We were able to work together on this. And actually it worked for us. Like at some point, it was like a switch, what I said earlier. Like people just started to get it. And that was amazing. So at the beginning, we had like a couple of like, I don't know, shy. It's like, oh yeah, they get it. They ran through. But you're like unsure because like the next user test might just go in an entirely different direction. But at some point, it just turned into pure bliss. Like Rasmus here with all caps, like OMG, 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 like whatever. Or I remember this experience of smiling so hard because I actually had to turn off the camera because I was like, yes, they got it. And you don't want to do that during a user test. So you're like, oh, the camera turned off. Yeah, okay, interesting. Okay, please continue. And I mean, to be honest, you can't show that level of excitement in in-person user tests. And as mentioned earlier, we also celebrated these kind of like closure moments. So you kind of like see Show renaming the channel from states to variants once we kind of like finalized that decision, or Matthew deleting the user testing branch once we felt like sure that we can like, yeah, like I don't know, productionize this now and like finalize this. And why are we telling you all this? When Kelsey and I were kind of like working on this talk and we were kind of like recapping the last couple of months, we realized that this combination of failing together in the open, of like iterating a ton, and at the same time also just having so much fun with everyone involved from kind of like across the company, that combination of all of things was new for us. That combination was beautiful because we truly believe that through regularly and repeatedly seeing everyone else failing and learning in the open, you actually give everyone permission to fail. And this creates a culture in which anyone can feel comfortable contributing their bold, new, and novel ideas. And this matters so much because those bold, novel, risky ideas, the ones that you're like, I don't know if I should say this, like those are at the core of improvement, innovation, and change. And because people need to feel comfortable to be able to talking out loud those ideas. And so we are sharing this story with the hope that you are now inspired to create an open and inclusive culture in which you can invite anyone really, to join in and failing together. Thanks a lot.